Uruguay, Bolivia. We had a recent election in Colombia, and certainly Venezuela doesn't have elections till next year, but certainly the situation in Venezuela politically is extremely interesting and changing every day. So we're going to look at both the elections as well as the broader political developments. I hope to do a couple of rounds of questions to these colleagues, and then we'll try to get your questions and comments as well. Let me just introduce them very, very briefly in the order in which they'll speak. And then we'll proceed. Diego Escosteguy is the Brazil bureau chief of ÉPOCA Magazine. Before that, he was the magazine's politics editor, and he's also worked at Veja magazine and also Estado São Paulo. Ignacio Zuasnabar is the public opinion director and services manager at Equipos Consultores in Uruguay, which is the country's principal social research firm. He's also a professor at the university, the Catholic University in Uruguay. Gustavo Fernández is a former foreign minister of Bolivia, and he was the minister of the presidency and also was Bolivia's ambassador to Brazil in the early 1980s. Juanita León is the director of Silla Vacía, a Colombian news website that tracks political developments in Colombia. She has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and also worked for Semana magazine in the past. And Luis Vicente León is the president of Datanálisis. It's a survey database that specializes in global markets. He also teaches at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello and in Caracas, as well as IESA in Caracas, and there's comments widely and frequently on Venezuelan politics. So we're delighted to have Luis Vicente with us. And to take a broader look, we're very, very happy to have Hector Schamis with us. Hector is a professor at Georgetown University, and he also is a columnist for El País. And his columns on Sunday is obligatory reading. So Hector will try to look at some of the countries that perhaps haven't been covered by the others, and also try to sort of put things in a broader context and perspective. President Calderon, in his speech earlier, mentioned the upcoming election in Brazil, Diego, and clearly this is a case where the unexpected, a very tragic accident has really changed the situation and the outlook, and the elections are just a month from now, so they're coming up on us, and obviously what happens in Brazil, as President Calderon says, is not only critical for Brazil, but I think for all of us in the hemisphere. So I guess the question is, we've seen in the recent polls the rise of Marina Silva in the polls, and your sense of and some vulnerabilities and weaknesses of the government, of the Dilma Rousseff government. What do you think? Is this rise going to continue until, I'm assuming there would be a second round, but is this rise going to continue? Is this, what accounts for it? What is the situation in terms of the weakness of the government, the strength or the appeal of Marina Silva, and how do you see this playing out in this election?
First, it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank CAF and OAS, and also the Inter-American Dialogue, and you, Michael. The Brazilians are facing now a very particular and strange moment. because what defines this election is Brazilians' desire to change politics. So it's not about the economy as it usually is, right? And before the death of Campos, who was heading the candidacy with Marina as vice president, right? This feeling was under the radar. It had manifested itself very loudly and deeply in last year's protests. Millions took to the streets. I'm sure we all seen that. And Marina was already a very strong candidate for the presidency. But for internal circumstances, she had to choose to run with Campos. So this tragic accident catapulted Marina to the spotlight. And there's something very important here. Marina's growth in the polls is not directly linked to the commotion or the emotion caused by the accident. Marina is her own. She has her own strengths. She has her own electorate. She has voters. 20 million Brazilians voted for her in the last election. So she's not just a phase, you know. Of course, there is a wave now because Campos had 9-10% of the votes before his death, and now she has almost 30%. She's almost tying with Dilma in the first round, and she wins in the runoff, according to all the most respected polls in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So if the election was held today, Marina would be the president. Is her vote, is the polls, are they solid enough for this last month, or may this fade out? The most likely scenario is that this is not just a phase. I mean, she probably, things can, of course, things can get out of hand, Dilma can balance things, but the most likely scenario today is Marina going against Dilma in the runoff. She has tapped very deeply on this Brazilian desire to change politics, change the way things are done. In this sense, she's very similar with Obama. The hope, the desire, the wave, the seemingly unstoppable wave of change. This is happening in Brazil right now. Maybe she's not a skillful politician, so she may commit some mistakes along the way, a month from now, and lose some points and not win. But she is the real thing, you know. She's actually making history right now, and she is committing to market principles. She has already talked to Brazil's major players and the banks in the industry. So she's not only gaining momentum, but she's also being very skillful. Her team is being very skillful in this sense to obtain the right kind of support in who owns the country, who runs things in Brazil. So she's very focused, and she has less money, less TV ads, but she is doing handsomely great with the more educated, the people who have more money, the urban middle class is all going with her. And of course, we have to be humble at this moment, right? But all signs point to the very likely scenario that she will meet Dilma, the incumbent, in the runoff. So it's the Brazilian election is a very fast race. It's like 100 meters. It's not a marathon. So any mistake can be unforgiven. And Dilma, the incumbent, has a lot of problems. I'm sure the audience is well aware of those problems. Her government has not been a success. Some Brazilians like her, of course. She has some solid votes among the poorest and those who depend more upon social programs. But she also has a high rejection level, and this threshold is she's at the threshold of not being able to be elected. She has 35% of rejection. So it's very difficult to imagine a win for Dilma in the first round. This much is clear, right? We can unpack some of these meanings for the audience, but this is the landscape right now.
Okay. Thank you. We'll come back to Brazil, but that was excellent. Thank you. Ignacio, vamos a cambiar a Uruguay. También están.
Also, you have been discussing change or possible change. That is, there is greater uncertainty today than perhaps a month or a couple months ago. The case of Uruguay, the economy is working quite well, as opposed to the case of Brazil, where difficulties have been encountered. How can you explain that it would seem that nowadays the situation is even more complicated? In the case of Uruguay, former President Abraham Vázquez, who is seeking power, has the CAIPU, the national party, that seems to have a certain strength and is attractive to different sectors. Why have there been such changes? What explains what is actually going on, and what can we expect as a result of the election in Uruguay? Hello, good afternoon. I would like to extend my gratitude to CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue for this invitation and to be able to share these ideas with you this afternoon. The analysis in Uruguay has certain commonalities with that of Brazil, although what is the greatest challenge to the government doesn't come from the left, but rather from the right, the traditional parties. The Frente Amplio has governed Uruguay during the last 10 years, and in keeping with public opinion has done so successfully. The present candidate of the Frente Amplio, who was president, Rieta Vázquez, is retiring from the government with a 75% approval rate, something which is unprecedented in the Uruguay's political history since surveys were taken first. So how is it that Vázquez is the candidate to the presidency? The scenario is such that it is so tremendously competitive, something that has happened only recently. We may come to this conclusion by analyzing three broad elements: the long term, the medium term, and the short term. In the long term, the Uruguayan voters are quite defined ideologically. Ideology is important. And the electorate in Uruguay, left and right, have similar sizes. The tremendous growth of left in Uruguay and the fact that they have governed the last 10 years did not transform the left in Uruguay into a sort of a cultural homogenizing trend over the right. This has been a parallel process, and both in 2004 and 2009, the result, the vote was defined by only a few points, but the right is still there, and the scenario is highly competitive. Secondly, in Uruguay, and this has to do with the medium term rather than the rather term, there has been a peculiarity in the last 60 years where most administrations lose a large amount of votes during the next election. 6 decades ago, the rulers of 2005, 2010, where Vázquez withdrew with 75% approval, but he lost 2% for the following elections, 75 to 48%. In the current administration, the levels are higher but lower than those of Vázquez. So if the historical trend should prevail, it is possible to think that there might be a cost for structural government in Uruguay. And the third level is much more situational. In the last few months, throughout this year, Vázquez has had a very poor campaign, presenting ideas and agendas which do not go along with the electorate, whereas the national candidate, very similar to the case of Marina in Brazil, but coming from a different ideological trend, but based on change, has tried to respond to certain unsatisfied demands of the Uruguayan electorate. And anyways, under these circumstances, and even if we're trying to be careful, there are some things which are quite clear in the case of Uruguay. In the first round in October, the Frente Amplio will be the party that will get the most votes. No doubt, this most important party in Uruguay and is the one that will receive the large amount of votes. The most possible scenario is that the Frente Amplio will not get 70% required to win the first round, so that there will be a need for second round. There would have to be a tremendous turn in the campaign for this to happen otherwise, and for the Frente Amplio to triumph in the first round. The second round, there are two traditional parties, one which is rightist, and the party and government unite their forces, and at this moment the situation is tremendously competitive. In the second round, scenarios are just show a 3-point difference favoring Vasquez, when at the beginning of the year the number favoring Vasquez was 18 points. So the scenario has truly changed and become highly competitive. We do not know whether these trends will prevail through the end of the election. 2 months now to the first round, almost. And the Frente Amplio is making changes in its campaign. For a few months, it was denying reality, disputing reality and surveys. But a few weeks back, there was a survey made which showed 39%, a drop beneath the 40%, which was already a symbolic level, and this generated 2 earthquakes before the Frente Amplio. And the First Lady, First Senator Angela, the President Jose Mojica, stated publicly, this is popular wisdom, which says that a true scare awakens the drunk man. So this scare of the Frente Amplio, after 4 or 5 surveys which they did not believe, generated a true change. So this is a reality. After 4 or 5 days, there was a qualitative change in the campaign of the Frente Amplio, changing the situation. And we can delve further into this point, but this results in the most probable scenarios that still might change. But as survey takers say, there will be a second round that will be highly competitive in Uruguay. Thank you. Thank you, Ignacio. Gustavo, as opposed to the 2 cases that we have just heard, it would seem, everything seems to point to the fact that there are good possibilities of continuity of the government of Morales for another period, having an economy which is quite strong in Bolivia, that is. How do you see the election, and what are the strengths of President Evo Morales, and how can you explain why is it? Because it would seem, do you share that there is a very important opposition at this point in time? How do you explain his strengths vis-a-vis the coming elections at the same date as Brazil's?
En Brasil, 5.
Ya, 5, sí.
La Paz, en Bolivia es el 12.
El 12, ya, perfecto.
A ver, Mike. Primero agradecer a Enrique, agradecer a Mike, a José Miguel por la invitación para participar en este.
Más alto.
¿Entendido? Creo
Se
que
está
no.
funcionando.
¿Está funcionando?
Sí.
¿Se escucha? ¿No?
¿Quieres que la más dure?
¿Dice algo que no debía?
Digo que escuchan a la más dure.
Ahí está mejor.
Can you hear me better? No, it doesn't seem to be working. Well, maybe you can use this one. Thank you. Thank you, Enrique and Jose Miguel, for this invitation. It is an honor for me to participate in this panel. Everything points to the fact that Evo Morales will win on October the 12th, and that we won't need to go to a runoff. And that's what the polls say. The 2 I'm familiar with. One gives 56% vis-a-vis 19%, the number 2. Another one 50 versus 18%. Both polls say that the total for the opposition is about 30%. But it is not the polls alone that show the trends. I think it's the general sentiment of the population. If you ask people who they think they will win, 75% say it will be Evo Morales. And the explanation is that if these are years of economic prosperity and political stability, then economic prosperity, of course, has to do with the tailwind of the hyper cycle of raw materials, but not only price increases, but diversification of the Bolivian economy, which is a significant fact that is often forgotten. It is a country that used to be dependent on tin exports, all of a sudden becomes more significantly producer of soybean. There is diversification of the economy, which explains the fact that prosperity has been spread throughout the different sectors of the Bolivian society. People are content. The data you're familiar with, they are significant. The exports have gone up from $1 billion when Enrique and I were ministers to now when we are about 13 billion. It's a significant increase in. So it grew by 13%. The reserves in the central bank are $15 billion for an economy such as the Bolivian. If you compare it to the current reserves of Venezuela and Argentina, we realize that this is significant. And finally, ECLAC and UNDP information says that poverty also had a significant decrease. It is true that a significant part of people who are no longer poor or have gone beyond poverty are still vulnerable, but their situation has changed. And if you were to visit Bolivian cities today, you would find out that the living conditions have changed in the country. This is clear. And if things continue to go well, why change? People change when they're afraid, scared, when they are tired. But if things are going well, why change? Consequently, everything would point to the fact that Evo Morales is going to win. But this is insufficient information if you do not relate it to another piece of information, not only the pragmatism of Evo Morales that could adapt to reality when he couldn't change reality, and that happened in his relation to Santa Cruz. The first political impulse in Evo Morales' administration was to try to control and destroy the economic power that seemed to be growing in Santa Cruz. But today, that's not the situation anymore. And in fact, the two large conflicts that seemed to be occurring in the Bolivian society 10 years ago, the conflict between the rural area and the urban area, trying to impose a rural vision, the Aymara a view over the rest of the Bolivian society, and then the other confrontation between the eastern economic power that was growing and the Western political side. These two have been overcome by the pragmatism demonstrated by Evo Morales in his administration. Evo Morales has not only benefited from economic situations that come from abroad, but he has properly managed things. We need to acknowledge this. This is not the only country that has received benefits, and there are some who have also received good benefits economically, but they are not in the same situation as Bolivia. The original indigenous and socialist project, community-based program that Evo Morales brought to power has changed. Today, the economic and political base of Evo Morales is the alliance between informal entrepreneurs, the coca growers, mining cooperative folks, and Western businessmen with Eastern-based formal entrepreneurs. If you check the media, you will see that we no longer hear a great deal about the indigenous movements. The Eastern indigenous people left the project and they're against the project, and the popular left base, the academics, the leftist academicians are denouncing Evo because they say he betrayed the original socialist project. This is a new project, a different project, which takes advantage of the circumstances and moves in this new space. Why? But what is the weakness of this project? The Bolivian political system, when democracy was built, was a fragmented system, political system, and the way to solve it was to look for a political consultation and agreement for good governance. This process has occurred in other places, but this process was broken down, and the large national dialogues that were to take place in long-term national interest ended up with the corruption of short-term economic corruption. And this led to people saying, well, we don't want this. And this is what has happened, more or less. But this fragmented political system with several parties has not become a one dominant party system, which initially it looked like that was going to be the case. But ERMAS is not a party. It does not have an institutional structure that works as a party. And the interests that are different from the components that make it up are not able to say that they have an ideology in common. So the process basically is a caudillista project. The weakness of the project is its strength itself. It depends on one single man more than ideas or ideals or a specific institution. And if you ask me why the opposition is where it is right now, the answer is that I think it's simple, because they did not understand that the country is different. This is just a flotsam and jetsam from the prior political system, and I'm part of that system, of course. But the country changed. The country changed. And we have not yet understood how the political system will continue to evolve to reestablish the partisan balance that needs to exist, so that the construction effort that has taken place in the recent years will not get lost with the problems of a caudillista government that depends on one man alone. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is your mic working? Maybe you can use the same mic. Juanita, then, to continue with the topic of continuity, because President Santos won the runoff election, and he was inaugurated almost a month ago. Colombians who voted for him want continuity from the first administration. What are the expectations for the second mandate? And politically, then, what is the strategy of the government to respond to the expectations that people have, especially related to the peace? Thank you very much for your invitation. Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Michael, thank you for the invitation. I think that in the first round, Colombians were voting for change. Juan Manuel Santos was defeated in the first round by the Uribista candidate, Oscar Iván Zuluaga. And I think the message of most Colombians was very clear. Well, we don't want to continue with the same government. And between the first and second round, when Santos showed two faces. First, the fear of Uribe, Álvaro Uribe's former president, coming back. And on the other hand, he presented a dilemma, which you either vote for the end of war or for a war without end. And I think these two variables together were able to mobilize very diverse groups, not voting for Santos, but voting against Uribe or or for peace. And so indigenous groups, the Afro-Colombians, the left, all these groups came together and they actively campaigned for Santos, and that's how Santos was able to win the second round. All this large coalition that voted for Santos had the expectation or the hope that Santos would get the message from the first round and would make some adjustments in his way of going about government. And I think the changes he made in his cabinet led to disappointments, and this is revealed in a poll that came out today where people are quite pessimistic once again, because Santos made up a cabinet which is exactly the same as the one that had 30% popularity 6 months ago. So he just moved them around, but they are the same people. He created an even more inbred cabinet, and they are all Santistas. They are for Santos, and these are the people who are very close to him, or Germán Vargas Lleras. The great change was the fact that Germán Vargas Lleras is now the vice president and has a great deal of power. Santos gave him a great deal of power in all the matters related to the budgetary execution that will be under Lleras. And I think this led to a great deal of disappointment. Many people thought he was going to make up a new cabinet, sending a new message saying that this will be an inclusive government in favor of peace, of transition for a country. But this is not the message that people are getting with his new cabinet. And only in 1 month of this new administration, he has faced the opposition of the sale of Isagen, which is the largest hydroelectric plant in Colombia, and even the Liberal Party was opposed to something the Minister of Finance wanted to do, and there are threats of strike in several places. The Conservative Party, on the other hand, elected a president of the party who is Uribista or Marta Lucista. But this is interpreted in Colombia, meaning that the person is not for Santos, but rather Uribe or Marta Lucia. So the president is facing political situations or conditions that are difficult, and there's still hope for the progress of the peace process. The FARC have corrected the president, saying, no, we are not close to the end, they say. We are still a long ways to achieve peace. I think the president used the great optimism after the great performance of the Colombian selection during the World Cup, but now all of that is waning and is no longer the case. So people are faced with reality. Now, regarding Venezuela and Chavismo for 15 years, and now Maduro, after Chavez's death and the election of Maduro, it seems that Venezuelan conditions are quite difficult, economic issues and security, etc., all the issues that we are familiar with. How do you evaluate the weaknesses and strengths of Maduro and the change we saw yesterday? How should this be interpreted in political terms regarding government, the ability of the government to maintain itself? There are signs of change. Are there? Or are things the same in terms of political structure, of political forces, and also economic issues? Well, first of all, I would like to say that we need to be very creative to do any kind of analysis with Venezuela. Today, every day we need to invent something else to try to understand what's going on, and you need to be your own interpreter. These are changes that are very hard to understand. The messages are confusing, they are opposing, and they confuse both the economic and social interpretation. So that's the first element. And I would say that in Venezuela, most people try to locate the political crisis first. But I want to say that, yeah, maybe things would change and change quickly or slowly, but at this point in time, we right now do not have a political crisis. The president is Mr. Maduro, and at this point in time, he is not facing political crisis that threatens his stability or his government. So this is not going on. In fact, there is an economic crisis. The economic crisis is awful. We are talking about an economy with the highest inflation rate in the world. We have a problem of scarcity for basic products. In control prices, we, for example, do mystery shopping every week, and in Caracas, which is the city that has the most products, you have 63% scarcity of basic products, and that it reaches over 90% when we talk about oil, sugar, and flour. And this is even more dire in the interior of the country, not Caracas. The central bank said we would see a severe drop in the gross domestic product. However, in Argentina, they manipulate data. In Venezuela, you don't manipulate, you just don't publish the data. So if the bank says, oh, the GDP didn't go down, then it didn't go down. No data are published, so people don't know what's going on. So it is by not publishing that things are kept a secret. So in an economic crisis of this nature, the popularity of the president will be affected. There is historic relationship between the economy and the perception by the people of the performance of the administration. 81% of the people evaluate the situation of the country poor or very poor. And with these figures that are historic records in for us, we had never seen such a negative evaluation by the population. Never before had we seen this. This is a new situation, and this obviously affects the situation of President Maduro. However, this connection drops much less than one would have expected, given the description of this dire situation, this dire crisis. Yes, Maduro has dropped 16 points between December and August in popularity. This is a significant drop. Well, Maduro is not Chavez, and Chavez had between 60 and 63% of popularity, and Maduro won the election with the country that was split for official data by 1 point. For the opposition, who argued that there had been fraud in the election, it would have been winning by 1 or 2 points. But we're talking about a country that is divided, completely divided. So Maduro had 50.4% of popularity, and losing 16 points is undoubtedly a significant issue. So if we see the trend is negative and consistent, the trend is not as serious as we would have imagined. But if we think of the absolute value of popularity, Maduro, what does he have between 34 and 35% of popularity right now, or popular acceptance right now? Faced with election, 34 to 35% is dramatic for Chavism, which has had very significant majorities. Maduro could not win the election with 34, 35%, because even with the divided opposition close to elections, the there is the possibility that the opposition may come together. When you're approaching an election, and there should be a mechanism through which they could come together for the election. So Maduro, were he to be elected today, or then he would be in trouble. But far from the elections, and the elections are at the end of 2015 for parliamentary elections. So Maduro doesn't have this problem today. So we need to assess how hard it is for Maduro to have 34-35% popularity today with the elections far away. So the non-electoral events that happened this year in Venezuela, which were very significant protests by significant portions of the population, which were very important politically, were dismantled completely by the government, even with significant repression. But it is worth saying that it also divided the opposition, because it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. Not all the opposition was in agreement with what was going on, and therefore the opposition becomes divided. And when they are going nowhere, then what happened? There is an internal confrontation by the opposition. And if you analyze impact coefficients regarding Maduro's popularity, something counterintuitive happens, and it is that barricades were more positive vis-a-vis Maduro's popularity. So he used the more radical demonstrations to prevent a higher fall due to the economic crisis. So Maduro was able to surf the economic crisis much better, because the attention was focused on something else, on a protest that failed. In politics, though, we don't know when something will become a relevant factor. Maybe in the future this will set the tone, but at this point in time, this is no longer in play, and this is considered to be a failure. And if you add the fact that Maduro today depends a great deal more on the military than what Chavez was, paradoxically, while being a military man, Chavez was hyper popular. He was a mature leader, but Maduro does not have the levels of popularity as Chavez had, and he needs the military support to be able to govern. And so the military have gained greatly in Venezuela, and this was consolidated yesterday with a declaration by Maduro, who everyone was waiting for an economic announcement for taking care of the crisis in the country. It's not that people went crazy waiting for Maduro to do something. He, for several months, insisted that it was necessary to change the exchange rate. They said that they needed to increase the price of gas because hundreds of thousands of dollars were being lost. He said that prices had to be negotiated with the private sector, otherwise there would be a great deal of smuggling toward Colombia. But what they expected was that the government say something about that, and he said nothing about any of those points. He said, no, I'm not going to say anything, and I'm not going to do anything about that. And the reason why over these past months he said that some adjustments were coming was that he was making fun of Reuters and Associated Press so that they would believe that an adjustment was coming. This was the explanation by Mr. Maduro on national media. So what did he do yesterday? And this is true. What he did yesterday basically was the ministers protected themselves. And there is a great deal of gossip involved in there. But the first thing is that there is no announcement regarding the economy, and that the situation is live. Even though every time we come here to talk about Venezuela here every single year, most analyses conclude that this is unsustainable. I presented last week the speech when I graduated as an economist 35 years ago, and I said, this is unsustainable 35 years ago. So this is the status quo, and this is what Maduro has decided. Why? Because he could not deal with the more radical wing of Chavismo that feels that any change is a violation to the memory of Chavez and against the revolution. So he was not able to prevent or to take a step back and carry out any change that could be conceived as positive, and he is a prisoner of the more radical elements of Chavismo. On the other hand, we see the loss of power by Ramirez within what was his splendor in controlling PDVSA, where the money comes from for everything. So if you reduce control, your control over resources. And even when the actors in PDVSA are actors that are close to you, these things never work. If you change the mayor and you put your best friend as the mayor and you think you're going to control him, you do not understand a thing.
As soon as you leave, the thing is over. And that is a bit what will happen also with Ramirez, that the opposition has less power than they had at the beginning. But I think that what he had, in any case, is changing. But the radical Chavistas are also not going into economy. They're going into the politics. The appointment of former Foreign Minister Hawa, that everybody thinks, oh, he lost a big power because he didn't. But he was only appointed as vice president of communes. Well, people who think that that's a loss of power don't understand anything, because communes are the main axis of the strengthening of a revolution, which attempts to replace, for instance, the mayors elected by the people, independent because they can collect taxes, by communes that will depend on the resources given directly by the state. And they are not elected by anyone except amongst themselves. So these processes are processes whereby Hawa, who is a part of the radical wing of Chavismo, will have much greater strength, which indicates that the more radical wings of Chavismo are gaining terrain in the political area and can strengthen the revolution as far as control is concerned. And finally, the last message is that the sector that does get more terrain in the economy is the military sector. They not only are part of the Ministry of Finances, but also the economic vice presidency. The ministers that control food imports have changed. This is 68% of the public imports that are already almost half of all of the imports of the country. So basically, that is a basic economic control, which also controls the business sector in Venezuela. So that's what I wanted to say to conclude, that what it indicates is that the causes of the crisis are not being tackled. The crisis will continue deteriorating the economy in the next few months. Still, Maduro will maintain the status quo, and for now, he will simply surf in the political area. There may be some spontaneous social explosions, but he still has institutional and military strength. The military sector feels that to defend Maduro is to defend itself. Thank you. Thank you, Luis Vicente. Let us surf then, and let us go to Hector, to see, well, Hector, you have listened to these five very interesting cases. Do you see a general pattern, a general trend regarding democratic strength, the rule of law, or is that impossible to try to generalize in such a complex region? How do you see it? Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Enrique. One can generalize. It's a bit as the drunk man who gets scared. I think that's how we should generalize what is happening, because I can tell you what are the things that worry me and then see if this makes sense in terms of the various electoral cycles of the countries in question. I'm saying the fact that we are finally recognizing that we are reaching a change in the cycle in the prices of export products, and that Latin America is once again going into stage in its economic history and development, which is its ability, a lack of ability to have a counter-cyclical policy, and that Latin America is going into a period of slowing down of growth. In other words, where, like the drunk man, he will wake up from his hangover. That is the fear that the drunkard has in Latin America. And as far as that is concerned, I'm worried about these typical boom and bust cycles repeating themselves in Latin America, which have always had been related to the prices of export commodities and also liquidity. Latin America has enjoyed three things that cannot be repeated and that led to an excellent situation: low rates, high price of commodities, historically high prices, and liquidity. It had that, and then it grew. But the problem is that this has come to an end due to depreciation in the commodities, a decrease in demand. Tomorrow there will be a panel on economics and on the economy itself. I don't want to talk about that, but this leads to the first question about if growth has occurred or not, and if we have grown because there's been good policy or good luck. Well, in some cases there has been good luck, and in other cases there were good policies, in others there were not. So the issue is, when the boom begins becoming a bust, where does one stop and the other begin? There are some countries that have had fiscal savings and have brought and built institutions for that, and they're more ready than others. So clearly, there are two countries that are already in a situation of bust, Venezuela and Argentina, in that order, who have had a more significant reduction in demand. They will go through even more of that. Brazil is close to that because of its fiscal problems. It's interesting to see that Lula had the will to do savings in resources as a countercyclical policy. Dilma not so much, or at least not to the full extent. And Brazil is another country, is a third country, I would say, where we have to see if the landing is soft or hard. Then we have the countries of the Pacific Rim, the Pacific Alliance countries. They have saved fiscal resources. And then there are countries in Central America that are closer to Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil as far as their situation is concerned, not only because they did not save fiscal resources, but because they did not have countercyclical policies, and they have been excessively dependent on the Venezuelan energy subsidy, which is coming to a close, and on Venezuelan imports. And that has also decreased significantly this year. So they are also candidates for a crash. Why is this of concern to me? Because the quality of democratic institutions, which essentially has deteriorated in the region. There has been a significant deterioration. There's a kind of, well, in our region, we have a kind of virus which knows no borders, no ideologies, no parties, and that is the virus of constitutional reform to stay in power. That is very contagious, that kind of virus. And each one can imagine the map of Latin America and can place a flag in a country where the president in power changed the constitution. And in many cases, by the way, it has been a pending issue, but still, at the same time, these people simply stayed. And this situation persisted, and this, in turn, has changed the health of the democratic system, because in order to stay in power and to reform the constitution and stay in power, and by the way, all countries, almost all countries have done so, even Brazil with Enrique Cardoso, the man with the strongest democratic credentials in the region, he also changed the constitution and remained in power. And this has generated two very complicated dynamics for democracy to operate. And they are the need to concentrate enormous political resources in the president's office to change the constitution. And this in turn affects two main and essential relationships. In Latin America, we see that especially if compared to the history of democratic transition since the 80s. And these two dynamic factors are a concentration of legislative power in the executive branch, an executive branch that legislates, and that legislates by either avoiding the parliament and Congress or by having a majority and using the Congress as simply a legitimacy stamp of approval. There are other countries, Argentina, for instance, where the budget and in Congress can take over. It will be approved in only 48 hours. It's an example, but not the only one. And this, in turn, has generated, as a result of the need to concentrate power and to stay forever, the elections in Bolivia are an example, because even under its own constitution, Evo Morales would not be a legitimate candidate. But the Constitutional Tribunal decided that before it was another state, and the new constitution not only promotes a new political order, but creates a new state. So the irony is that in Latin America, states change, but the presidents are the same. It should be the other way around. And that has also affected the independence of the judicial branch and the rule of law, juridical security, and human rights. President Calderon himself mentioned that we could do things much better as far as human rights are concerned. An agenda of political change that made us outstanding as a region. If you say, well, why was there democratization during the 80s in Latin America? Because of the human rights agenda and movement. And that is an agenda and a subject and a need that is now regressing. Venezuela, Ecuador, question of freedom of the press that has been shown in the news on a daily basis. And to conclude, I would like to say that in those countries where there is a hard landing together with this institutional weakness and a low density of the institutional fabric of democracy, there's one very important factor which is of great concern, and that is that in Latin America there has been a redistribution of income, of the Gini coefficient, less inequality, new middle classes, that is important, and many of these new middle classes are candidates in the context of hard landing and of a slowdown of the economy. They're candidates to going back to poverty, and that is an explosive cocktail, a virulent explosive cocktail, because on the other hand, many of these countries don't have the institutional strength to mediate this conflict between a large social group that has grown in numbers in the last few years and that has acquired great expectations of mobility, and who, under a possible slowdown or a crash of the economy, will see these expectations frustrated. It's a young population. Latin America is a young population with young people who are well educated vis-a-vis their elders and not well absorbed by the labor market. And this presupposes an enormous volatility where our good democracies will begin to go through great turbulence, I think. Thank you. Thank you, Hector. Thank you for your analysis.
Time is limited. We have about 15 minutes, and I was going to go back to our speakers, but I'd rather maybe get one or two questions from the audience. I think we have time for a few, and then maybe have time for a few responses. Let me ask, before Diego, just a quick question, and everybody, and then we can get others. The role of Lula. What should we look for in the last month, the Brazilian election? Will Lula play an important role or not? What should we look for?
I don't think so. I think Lula is not that much a strong political force right now. He's not showing himself so committed to Dilma's re-election, and so I think Dilma will have to rely more on her own political clout, the money she has raised, the TV ads, her own strategy. That is, she has all the government apparatus to try to stop this Hurricane Marina.
Hurricane Marina. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, David, a question right there, and then we'll get a few questions, and then we'll.
Thank you. David Atkinson, Princeton in Latin America. Voy a hacer una pregunta.
I'm going to ask a question that will sound a bit naive, but it's about Bolivia. I would like to know if any opposition candidate in Bolivia has publicly acknowledged the benefit of the 90s reforms. And by the way, the people who implemented them, if these people have been acknowledged. And if that is the case, if they have expressed the support for these reforms, which are the reforms that led to the very favorable situation of Bolivia of today, both economically and socially. So I would like to know which of the opposition candidates has said something in favor of these reforms. And if that is not the case, if no one has said absolutely anything in favor of these reforms of the 90s, why is that the case?
Yes, sir. Yeah. And then Marta Lucia after.
Former Minister of Defense of the first government of President Morales. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the former Minister of Public Affairs from Bolivia for his frankness and clarity. However, if I may, I would like to make two clarifications. First, President Evo Morales, more than a caudillo, is a leader who has brought together the Bolivian society. And I clarify this because the former foreign minister said that MAS is not a political party. It is not, in effect, a traditional political party, but it has brought together the sectors of the Bolivian society who used to be excluded. And in addition, it also speaks about the exclusion of the indigenous people. And since Evo Morales has been a leader in that process, his re-election is undoubtable, as well as his popularity. By the way, the popularity index of President Morales is of over 70%. So more than a question, I just wanted to make that first clarification. And the second one has to do with the Constitutional Tribunal. It is very important to see that the constitutional change that occurred in Bolivia in 2007, 2008 led to more rights, to an expansion of the rights, in fact, to include the indigenous sectors who are the greatest part of the Bolivian society. Now, in that constitutional change, the opposition forces decided to prevent the re-election of the president. So it was the other way around. What the Constitutional Tribunal has done then is to do the right thing, and that is to allow re-election, which is simply this one. Thank you. Thank you. Marta Lucia? Here. I would like to congratulate all the panelists. They've made a very comprehensive presentation of the progress made in each country. But I still have the feeling that all of the countries here are sort of navigating towards an iceberg, some quicker than others, and some with better defenses than others. And I do think it is important to speak about the role played by political parties. Political parties have lost their prestige, their reputation. They have lost their credibility, but it is essential to work to strengthen their legitimacy and the relevance of their agenda. This is also linked to corruption. I think the representative of Venezuela, or maybe the last speaker, said that because of re-elections, well, power is more concentrated on the presidency, but the concentration of power at times has shadows similar to corruption. The use of public resources to be re-elected, the excessive use of official publicity, the use of power benefits in favor of the political group in power. This has a lot to do with the need to strengthen the political parties to provide them with greater legitimacy. And unfortunately, we have not seen that kind of agenda in our hemisphere. I just think this is a point for reflection.
Yeah, there's one right there.
Gracias. Gracias, Ricardo.
Thank you. Ricardo Platt from Mexico. This is regarding Venezuela. Luis Vicente, we agree, and in other fora we have said that the situation is unsustainable in Venezuela. It is true. Earlier on, we heard former President Calderon say that now something needs to be done for other countries in that area. So I would like to ask if there's something that you as Venezuelans feel that realistically can be done given the reality other presidents, by other presidents, is there something that would be truly beneficial that could be done? David?
Gracias. David Myers, academic from Penn State. This is basically to Luis Vicente, but it could be, it could be to everybody. One of the things that you said is that the government put HAWA in to strengthen the communes, which means really undermining and maybe even getting rid of the municipal levels. If the municipal levels in Venezuela, where the opposition has its greatest strength, lost much of its clout, how much would that impact on the ability of the opposition to mount national election campaigns? And this also could be, in general, for the whole panel. To what degree does decentralization and centralization have an impact on the overall outcome of national elections?
Thank you. In the back, please. Yes. Okay. And then the final question up here, and then we'll go back to the panelists.
Yes, thank you. Magali Sanchez, Princeton University. I have two questions. Tengo dos preguntas.
I have two questions for Mr. León, and thank you to all the panelists. The presentation is very interesting. Mr. León from Venezuela spoke about very important data that, in my opinion, show great political legitimacy by President Maduro. But then you assert that there's no political crisis. And at the end of your presentation, you speak about the maintenance of the status quo of the present policy. You spoke about the economic crisis and also the social crisis. So my question is, I don't quite understand how you can say that there's no political crisis when data show that it is a country that is very divided and that there's no support as Chavismo had under President Chavez. There's no continuity in Chavismo. We know that. And the final observation is on the assertion, and maybe I'm out of the context, but as far as I know, there is a division in the opposition. Well, the opposition was always a table of unity of different tendencies, and this is what has given it continuity. The fact that throughout history they have been able to stay together even though there's a diversity of opinions and points of view. Thank you. Cecilia Lopez? Thank you. I have a question for Juanita and another one to the panelists. Juanita, Venezuela, apparently what is going through is an economic crisis and not a political crisis. Would you say that Colombia, that is doing so well economically, doesn't have an economic crisis but does have a political crisis? And to the panelists in general, my question is, why the United States is so much more worried about economic crisis than political crisis? Thank you. Professor Vivanco, Jose Miguel Vivanco from Human Rights Watch. I have a question for Diego. The election of Marina Silva, to what extent would that change or could it affect the foreign policy of Brazil, especially vis-a-vis the promotion of human rights and public freedoms in Latin America, mostly and specifically how would it affect its relationship with Venezuela?
Then go to the end. 2 minutes each one. I want to ask Ignacio also if he would ask, does it make a difference who wins in Uruguay in terms of politics, if the Frente is reelected and Tabaré is in, or whether Lacalle will we see? What should we expect depending on which way it goes? What would be the difference there? Diego, you want to start?
Yeah, to be brief, Marina is a sphinx, so it's very hard to project each of her policies. But in terms of foreign relations, it's more likely that she will take into account human rights and other kind of issues, and not only treat foreign relations as an equal to economic relations. So in this sense, it's possible that she would be reluctant to continue the trade with Argentina and Venezuela in the way that is being done today. The relationship with Mercosur will probably change a little bit, not that much, and bilateral agreements will be reinforced. But with caution, not a radical change or anything like that. But I mean, it's still something to be seen because she's not very clear about that.
Great. Thank you. Ignacio?
Bien, bueno, como usted sabe,
Well, as you know, Uruguay is a mature democracy where even though the left and right are different, and there are clear differences, as we said before, today there's a great convergence in the public opinion of Uruguay on the political lines. We're not in an election where the result will lead to the continuity of policies or not. Policies will continue, but one thing that can happen, and that would be similar to what is happening maybe in Brazil, and something similar happened in Chile, when Piñera and his party lost, is that the leftist parties in Latin America have built good stories for the opposition parties, and it has been more difficult to build stories for parties in the government in the context of growth. So that could be a key to see what will happen in the next few weeks. Gustavo, just 2 minutes. First, the impact of economic reforms and the political reforms of the 90s. It is apparent that Evo Morales' administration benefited from the contracts of purchase of natural gas with Brazil and the conditions that were agreed on the price formula, which then led to a situation where the state was able to have a certain level of resources, a high level of resources. We also have to say that Evo Morales improved the tax formula in its relationship with those companies that operate in the gas sector. This is from the economic point of view. Now, from the political point of view, it is apparent that democracy built throughout the years, throughout the 90s, that is what allowed radical transformation. In the mythical vision of the left of the past, liberal democracy was an obstacle to political and social transformation. However, facts have proven that democracy could make a profound change viable. So that is a posthumous victory of Allende's position vis-a-vis Che Guevara, two very different lines of thought. And if we see today the situation not only of Bolivia, but also of El Salvador and of other countries of the region, you can see that it was the political and democratic path that opened the doors for a profound change. That's on the one hand. Second, it is apparent that the Bolivian electoral process included an absolute control of the state on the institutions that manage the electoral process. Only 12 or 14%, I don't think it's more than that, of those consulted by opinion surveys believe that the electoral supreme tribunal was impartial. Nobody believes in its impartiality. And as has been said, there are many questions about the legal soundness of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, which allowed for President Morales' re-election. But beyond that, we have to see that even under those circumstances, it would seem that those circumstances are secondary vis-a-vis the true fact that the Bolivian people have supported President Morales in this election. I would also like to say that, and surveys show that the priorities or the main subjects of the national agenda have changed vis-a-vis the past. They're talking about the lack of security, corruption, and drug trafficking. These are the main concern for the Bolivian society. 73% of the population believes that these are the political and social agenda issues. Traditional issues such as economy, health, and education are only 12%. So there has been a substantial change in the political and economic conditions of the country, whereby there's a different view on what is going to come in the future. Thank you. Juanita.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's an excellent question, and I would say rather than a what we have is something that could reach ahead and become a crisis, and what's taking place are a number of things that have created this situation. For example, a partisan outlook on ideology. If we look at the different parties involved, Partido Liberal, we got the Liberal Party, we got the right-wing Conservative Party, and the Uribe's Central Democratic Party, and so that has led to certain vitality there. Now, it seems to me that in Colombia, for the first time, there's organized opposition that's explicit. That is, the explicit right has come out of the closet. They have always played the role of a opposition party, but they did so through other means, and now there's a formal right stance in the Congress, and this is something new, and that is also causing this irritability, this irascibility. And there's also the emergence of social movements as political actors, something that Colombia was also not very used to. And I think that puts on the table the legitimacy in the future of political parties, the formal ones anyway. And I think, furthermore, as Santos's government is so deft in how he deals with the opposition and given the majorities in the Congress, it seems like the opposition is taken to the streets, and so they're not working out their differences in the Congress nor in the media, which oftentimes is the forum for opposition. And so that opposition ends up taken to the streets. And then this peace process and this uncertainty regarding exactly what's going to result from that, how it's going to affect the country. And so this peace process, I think, is going to end up breaking or transforming from the bottom up politics as usual. And so I think all of these variables taken together have caused this political irritability, because it seems like the president doesn't really exercise true leadership. It's just one play after the next, and so oftentimes people are always testing him. And so I think this is the next couple of months is going to be very interesting. 2 minutes, Luis Vicente. Every time my children ask me how things were in my time, and I say, this is my time, the time of Chavez. Now, to try to wrap that up in 2 minutes, it makes it that much harder. But let's talk about the international politics. That's always a very thorny issue, because it's very sexy, fancy, attractive to ask for assistance in Washington. Send the Marines in, and we'll solve our problem. But no one's going to applaud me when I say that that's not going to be the solution to our problem. That's just going to make things more complicated. That's the easy fix, but it's not going to help. And so we have three possibilities. The first one is to not do anything, and it's tried and true, that by doing nothing, that's what you get. The second is, I'm going to do everything. I'm going to go in full bore, and experience has, along those lines, have been very negative. And so I think the most prudent path ahead, or strategy rather, would be for us to accompany this process of institutionalization, the relationship, and to make this a ongoing diplomatic issue that we follow through on with engagement with international organizations. I think that's far more important. That is what's being discussed by the human rights organizations is more important than any particular sanction that ultimately doesn't solve the overall problem. So when we're talking about a topic that's highlighted, that's being debated, that people are focused on, then that's something that's being dealt with here and there. The best strategy what we see right now is that we are recovering diplomatic relations. We've got charge d'affaires now. That's going to be very useful. And the other way around, also, the charge d'affaires of Venezuela and the United States is atypically a spectacular professional, very serious, who very well might strike up a new type of relationship that can bring pressure to bear. It's really easier to get things done when someone is speaking with you respectfully than someone who's yelling at you. That's a more serious approach than these harebrained ideas. So I think now moving forward on this issue of communes, that leads to concentration of power. Theoretically, it seems like you're devolving power to the people, but ultimately what you're doing is eliminating the people's election system, their representatives, taking resources away from mayors, keeping the mayors from being able to show different alternatives, and reducing the opposition's ability to finance itself in a country that doesn't finance campaigns with official financing funds. And that's why, well, there's this fear of injecting money into electoral campaigns, and that actually makes it more difficult. Now, legitimacy. When I refer to the political crisis, I'm talking mostly about the fact that we are not on the verge of a blow-up that's going to take Maduro out of power. Now you can have different negative indicators, a loss in popularity. That's an abstraction because something can happen anywhere in a country that heretofore seemed stable, and that shows us otherwise. Now Maduro is a country that has 35% rate of population, popularity rather. In how he governs the country without any elections on the horizon. You've got Peña Nieto 38, Ollanta 32, and so just by comparison. And so the issue is that he does enjoy a normal level of popularity for any president in office, but he did go through a domestic electoral process that was successful. And in the midst of this crisis, with a loss of popularity, he went to the Congress and he won. And he strengthened we're going back to the economic decisions, but politically speaking, he was able to rein in the domestic monster in that party, and now he was able to take all of his enemies out of those positions of authority. Now, what's going to happen now? This unity coalition, this is a group of people that thinks differently, they have different ideas, and they come together to think out how they're going to deal with a government that they're opposed to in a process that what actions they could bring about to exercise opposition to this government. But outside of the context of elections, the opposition isn't only heterogeneous, but they are groups that dislike each other. These aren't groups that just have different visions, but Leopoldo Lopez can't stand to see Capriles and vice versa. And none of them like Ms. Machado, and they don't want to see her, not even a picture of her. And these aren't just preferences, personal preferences. These come down to points of conviction and ideology. So the tension for electoral unification doesn't exist. And so the opposition, having gone through this process of radicalization of the electoral process, you have, certainly, there were those precursors of independence that failed, and they may have had the right idea, but they failed. And at this point in time, what we saw in the short term is that radicalization opposition failed in its attempt. And so we have 35% popularity. He is strong in the PC UV party, and he has control over the military sector, and he is strengthening his position, and an opposition that isn't cohesive. And so I don't really see any political crisis at this point in time. Thank you very much for that stance. It's very clear. But I think we understand what you're trying to say. Professor Schamis. Now, the question about political parties is still outstanding, and I agree. I always say that without parties, there's no democracy when I'm teaching, but I think this is mistaken because there are plenty of parties in Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, and parties as such. The idea of a party is having trouble nowadays. Now, who wins elections in Europe nowadays? Extreme right, Podemos, or some pirate party, which are political partisan formations. They may not be actual parties, but they are anti-system, anti-establishment. And look at the United States. You've got two parties that are at such loggerheads that they can't legislate anymore. And so you have all types of social groups that are anything but parties. And all this comes down to our history, fragmentation of society, heterogeneity. But what are we trying to coalesce, bring together? Societies are structurally that much more complex. We're talking about the occupational scene culturally and in other realms. And so certainly in Uruguay, the parties are more stable. They're better than those of other democracies in which parties have been become so fragmented. And in the U.S., the U.S. Has less structured power historically, and that is something that we see in Latin America. The discussion over lunch is that Latin America, U.S., Latin America, U.S., we're comparing the two. And 20 years ago, in 94, the Berlin Wall was coming down, the Soviet Union was falling apart, the European Economic Union was being expanded. The Latin America was letting in international market money, and if you fell asleep that day, you would wake up today, and after this long nap, and look at today's world, and you see that the Middle East, Ukraine, Latin America, the United States is a superpower that is not capable of wielding that power. And even under a situation of unipolar, a single superpower, given all of the different institutions that it has. And so we have a lot of neo-realists nowadays who are longing for the Cold War period. Mujica made a comment to that effect. He was called over the phone. And he said something to that effect, and this is something we see throughout Latin America, and we have the United States that is not capable of exercising or wielding the same type of influence that it did in the past. And if it did, it might be counterproductive for it to try to wield the power as it did in the past. And that's where we stand. Thank you, Hector.